The war between Russia and Ukraine has been raging for over a year now, and it shows no signs of ending. The conflict has already caused a humanitarian crisis, with millions of people displaced and thousands killed. But the consequences of the war could be even more far-reaching. If the war continues, it could have a devastating impact on the global economy. Energy prices have already risen, and there are concerns about food shortages. A prolonged war could lead to a global recession, and it could destabilize the global financial system. The war could also have a major impact on the global security landscape. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has already raised the risk of nuclear war. If the war continues, it could lead to a wider conflict involving other countries in the region. The war in Ukraine is a major challenge for the world. It is important to understand the potential consequences of a prolonged war so that we can work to prevent it from happening. Bear with us to understand what fatal consequences are waiting for us. The war is an unmitigated disaster for Ukraine. Putin made it clear in 2008 that Russia would wreck Ukraine to prevent it from joining NATO. He is delivering on that promise. Russian forces have conquered 20% of Ukrainian territory and destroyed or badly damaged many Ukrainian cities and towns. More than 6.5 million Ukrainians have fled the country, while more than 8 million have been internally displaced. Many thousands of Ukrainians, including innocent civilians, are dead or badly wounded, and the Ukrainian economy is in shambles. The World Bank estimates that Ukraine's economy will shrink by almost 50% over the course of 2022. Estimates are that approximately $100 billion worth of damage has been inflicted on Ukraine, and that it will take close to $1 trillion to rebuild the country. In the meantime, Kiev requires about $5 billion of aid every month just to keep the government running. Furthermore, there appears to be little hope that Ukraine will be able to regain use of its ports on the Azov and Black Seas anytime soon. Before the war, roughly 70% of all Ukrainian exports and imports, and 98% of its grain exports moved through these ports. It is downright scary to contemplate what Ukraine will look like if this war drags on for a few more years. So, what are the prospects for negotiating a peace agreement and ending the war in the next few months? What do you think? Please write your opinion in the comment section below. I am sorry to say that I see no way this war ends anytime soon. A view shared by prominent policymakers like General Mark Milley, the chairman of the JCS and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. The main reason for my pessimism is that both Russia and the United States are deeply committed to winning the war, and it is impossible to fashion an agreement where both sides win. To be more specific, the key to a settlement from Russia's perspective is making Ukraine a neutral state, ending the prospect of integrating Kiev into the West. But that outcome is unacceptable to the Biden administration and a large portion of the American foreign policy establishment because it would represent a victory for Russia. Ukrainian leaders have agency, of course, and one might hope that they will push for neutralization to spare their country further harm. Indeed, Zelensky briefly mentioned this possibility in the early days of the war, but he never seriously pursued it. There is little chance, however, that Kiev will push for neutralization because the ultranationalists in Ukraine, who wield significant political power, have zero interest in yielding to any of Russia's demands, especially one that dictates Ukraine's political alignment with the outside world. The Biden administration and the countries on NATO's eastern flank, like Poland and the Baltic states, are likely to support Ukraine's ultranationalists on this issue. To complicate matters further, how does one deal with the large swaths of Ukrainian territory that Russia has conquered since the war started, as well as Crimea's fate? It is hard to imagine Moscow voluntarily giving up any of the Ukrainian territory it now occupies, much less all of it, as Putin's territorial goals today are probably not the same ones he had before the war. At the same time, it is equally hard to imagine any Ukrainian leader accepting a deal that allows Russia to keep any Ukrainian territory, except possibly Crimea. I hope I'm wrong, but that is why I see no end in sight to this ruinous war. Let me now turn to the matter of escalation. It is widely accepted among international relations scholars that there is a powerful tendency for protracted wars to escalate. Over time, other countries can get dragged into the fight, and the level of violence is likely to increase. The potential for this happening in the Ukraine war is real. There is a danger that the United States and its NATO allies will get dragged into the fighting, which they have been able to avoid up to this point, even though they are already waging a proxy war against Russia. There is also the possibility that nuclear weapons might be used in Ukraine, and that might even lead to a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States. The underlying reason these outcomes might be realized is that the stakes are so high for both sides, and thus neither can afford to lose. As I have emphasized, Putin and his lieutenants believe that Ukraine joining the West is an existential threat to Russia that must be eliminated. In practical terms, that means Russia must win its war in Ukraine. Defeat is unacceptable. The Biden administration, on the other hand, has stressed that its goal is not only to decisively defeat Russia in Ukraine, but also to use sanctions to inflict massive damage on the Russian economy. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has emphasized that the West's goal is to weaken Russia to the point where it could not invade Ukraine again. In effect, the Biden administration is committed to knocking Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. At the same time, President Biden himself has called Russia's war in Ukraine a genocide and charged Putin with being a war criminal who should face a war crimes trial after the war. Such rhetoric hardly lends itself to negotiating an end to the war. After all, how do you negotiate with a genocidal state? American policy has two significant consequences. For starters, it greatly amplifies the existential threat Moscow faces in this war and makes it more important than ever that it prevails in Ukraine. At the same time, it means the United States is deeply committed to making sure that Russia loses. The Biden administration has now invested so much in the Ukraine war, both materially and rhetorically, that a Russian victory would represent a devastating defeat for Washington. Obviously, both sides cannot win. Moreover, there is a serious possibility that one side will begin to lose badly. If American policy succeeds and the Russians are losing to the Ukrainians on the battlefield, Putin might turn to nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. The U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, told the Senate Armed Services Committee in May that this was one of the two situations that might lead Putin to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. For those of you who think this is unlikely, please remember that NATO planned to use nuclear weapons in similar circumstances during the Cold War. If Russia were to employ nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it is impossible to say how the Biden administration would react, but it surely would be under great pressure to retaliate, thereby raising the possibility of a great power nuclear war. There is a perverse paradox at play here. The more successful the United States and its allies are at achieving their goals, the more likely it is that the war will turn nuclear. Let's turn the tables and ask what happens if the United States and its NATO allies appear to be heading toward defeat, which effectively means that the Russians are routing the Ukrainian military and the government in Kiev moves to negotiate a peace deal intended to save as much of the country as possible. In that event, there would be great pressure on the United States and its allies to get even more deeply involved in the fighting. It is not likely, but certainly possible that American or maybe Polish troops would get pulled into the fighting, which means NATO would literally be at war with Russia. This is the other scenario, according to Avril Haines, where the Russians might turn to nuclear weapons. It is difficult to say precisely how events will play out if this scenario comes to pass, but there is no question there will be serious potential for escalation, to include nuclear escalation. The mere possibility of that outcome should send shivers down your spine. There are likely to be other disastrous consequences from this war, which I cannot discuss in any detail because of time constraints. For example, there is reason to think the war will lead to a world food crisis in which many millions of people will die. The president of the World Bank, David Malpass, argues that if the Ukraine war continues, we will face a global food crisis that is a human catastrophe. Ukraine is one of the most important breadbaskets in the world. Now the question is, what is a breadbasket? The term breadbasket is used to refer to an area with highly arable land that produces a significant amount of food. The top breadbasket in the world is China, India, Canada, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. Ukraine plays a massive role in providing food for the world. It's a big country with fertile soil, plenty of rain, long hot summers, and enough farm labor, all of which combine to make it one of the world's biggest producers of crops. Before the war, Half of the world's sunflower oil came from Ukraine, as well as almost a fifth of the world's barley, a sixth of its maize, and an eighth of its wheat. These exports, especially of wheat, are crucial for some Asian and African countries, which are dependent on Ukrainian grain. Global wheat production was under stress because of poor harvests, and if no Ukrainian grain were to get through, the situation would be immeasurably worse. That is why EU countries, along with their partners in the international community, have taken action to try to prevent further disaster. Furthermore, relations between Russia and the West have been so thoroughly poisoned that it will take many years to repair them. In the meantime, that profound hostility will fuel instability around the globe, but especially in Europe. Some will say there is a silver lining. Relations among countries in the West have markedly improved because of the Ukraine war. That is true for the moment, but there are deep fissures below the surface, and they are bound to reassert themselves over time. For example, relations between the countries of Eastern and Western Europe are likely to deteriorate as the war drags on because their interests and perspectives on the conflict are not the same. Finally, the conflict is already damaging the global economy in major ways, and this situation is likely to get worse with time. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, says we should brace ourselves for an economic hurricane. If he is right, these economic shocks will affect the politics of every Western country, undermine liberal democracy, and strengthen its opponents on both the left and the right. The economic consequences of the Ukraine war will extend to countries all over the planet, not just the West. As the UN put it in a report released just last week, the ripple effects of the conflict are extending human suffering far beyond its borders. The war, in all its dimensions, has exacerbated a global cost of living crisis unseen in at least a generation, compromising lives, livelihoods, and our aspirations for a better world by 2030. Please share this video to make people understand the fatal consequences of the war so that they can prepare themselves. And if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to get the latest update. Until then, stay safe and be prepared.